Hey, champion guitar players, what's the best picking technique for guitar? Alternate picking, economy picking, or directional picking? Now, some people have some really strong opinions about what technique they think is the king, and I've seen a few get excited trying to defend their favorite picking technique that you'd think they were in some kind of religious war. Point is, I imagine this video will spark a bit of controversy. Hopefully not, but hey, this is the internet, so it probably will. And today, I'm going to lay out all the objective facts, the pros and cons of alternate picking, economy picking, and directional picking. I'll explain how each one works, and then you can decide for yourself what is the best technique for guitar when picking. Maybe you and I will agree, maybe not, and that's okay too. You can believe whatever you want. That said, I believe directional picking is far superior to both economy picking and alternate picking. I'll show you why I think so, but again, you decide for yourself. Just watch the entire video to the end, hear all the facts in context, and then let me know what you think in the comments. First, let's define exactly what the three major picking techniques are and the requirements to do each one strictly. So alternate picking is the strict alternation of down and up strokes regardless of what note you played before or what note is going to be played after. So if you look at the example, that you'll see that we have a strict alternation of down and up strokes no matter what is played. Doesn't matter if we're changing strings or not changing strings. It doesn't matter if it's convenient or not to change strings with an upstroke or a downstroke. It's always going to be a strict alternation of the picking strokes. Now, economy picking uses alternate picking motions when on the same string, but economy picking always requires a sweep picking motion when changing strings. Now, this is done for perfect maximum guitar picking efficiency and speed potential. So if you look at the example of an economy picking lick laid out with economy picking, you'll notice, however, that since the sweep picking motion is required without exception to change strings, economy picking must always be planned in advance. This means that many guitar licks are impossible to play using strict economy picking. Okay? So, economy picking is often confused with directional picking. The two picking techniques are vastly different in principle and in practice, even though they may look the same in some special situations. What is directional picking? The principle behind directional picking is to move the pick in the shortest possible way to the next note. Whether the note before was played with a downstroke or an upstroke doesn't matter. This way of picking notes on the guitar gives you the maximum efficiency to get to the following note without having to pre-plan notes in advance. Now that's very different from economy picking, which requires pre-planning and restricts what you can play with that technique. Now, if you look at the example on the screen, you will see that when we're on the same string, we're using alternate picking motions. We start with a down or an up, it doesn't really matter, but we're going to alternate between down and up when on the same string. When we change strings, we are not going to do what alternate picking requires. Alternate picking requires us to alternate between down and up. That's the rule. Doesn't matter what the scenario is, alternate picking requires strict alternation. Economy picking requires planning where you can only change strings when you're sweeping. Directional picking's requirement is completely different. Its requirement says, whatever you just did on the guitar, what is the shortest possible way to get to the next note? So we're concerned only with the next note, not the note we already just played. Okay, so if you look at the example, we'll start with a downstroke, but we could start with an upstroke. This wouldn't really matter. We start with a downstroke. Then we've got an upstroke, right? Because that's the shortest possible way, shortest possible distance for the pick to move, right? After you start with down and you're on the same string, you pick up. That's the most efficient picking motion you could use. Now, if you look at the third note, when we're going to change strings, we're picking that with a downstroke. And you might say, aha, that looks exactly like alternate picking. You just did down, up, down, exactly as it would be in alternate picking. No, that's not correct. It's true that the motions so far among the first 3 or 4 notes or 5 notes look like alternate picking, but it's not alternate picking. Why is it not? Because alternate picking has a requirement that says you must strictly alternate between down and up no matter what. Directional picking does not work this way. Directional picking, the rule is you must pick in the way that is most efficient to get to the next note. It doesn't matter what you did before. So economy picking, it does matter what you did before. Directional picking, it does not. Okay, so we start from the beginning. Down, then up. Now we're going to change strings. Now, given where the pick is currently at, it's on this side of string 6. The shortest possible movement I can make with the pick already in this position is to pick the next note with the downstroke. Similar to alternate picking, but for very different reasons. Now, I just played the third note of the example. So what is the shortest possible way, or shortest possible distance to play the fourth note? Upstroke, of course. Shortest possible way to play the fifth note? Downstroke, of course. So again, so far it looks like alternate picking, although it's not. Now look at note number 6. Okay, the first note of the second group of quintuplets. It's going to be the 7th fret of the 4th string. And this note we want to play with a downstroke. So we have a sweep picking motion here, kind of like economy picking. With economy picking, you would be making a sweep picking motion when changing strings. Okay? So you get down, up, down, down. So directional picking kind of looks like alternate picking sometimes, and it kind of looks like economy picking sometimes. But the rules, the requirements of each of the picking methods are totally different. Okay? So when we have I'm going between notes 5 and 6 in the example. Okay? When we have the 2 downstrokes there, this is simply because in this case, the downstroke is the shortest possible way, the shortest distance to get to the next note. In fact, you'll notice when you're ascending a scale, it doesn't matter what you did before, every new note, every first note of the new string will always be a downstroke. But the last note of the previous string is not necessarily an up or a downstroke. It's going to be whatever it is. So we're only concerned about the next note. And that's the major difference between economy picking, alternate picking, and directional picking. So where does the term directional picking actually come from? Although directional picking as a technique has been around for a very, very, very long time, I invented the term, the name, not the technique, but the name, back in 1989 to better describe this technique and the principle behind it, which again is to pick in the direct or shortest path to the next note, whether on the same string or a different string, without any pre-planning. Why do some people say alternate picking is the best picking technique for guitar? Well, some alternate pickers love to defend alternate picking. Some even seem to take it personally when anyone criticizes alternate picking, as if one was criticizing their mother or something. Sounds pretty crazy, doesn't it? Well, that's the world we live in. So now let's take a look at the 11 most popular claims that some people make to support the idea that alternate picking is the best. Then we'll explore each claim and see if each one of those is true and if it is true, if it's even relevant or not. So, claim number one, alternate picking, people say alternate picking is the best because it contains natural accents on every other note. We'll see about that. Another thing that people say is alternate picking is best because it has a distinctive sound. Really, I'm not sure about that, but we'll see. Next claim is, number three, alternate picking is best because it has a stronger articulation than other picking techniques. Well, maybe, we'll see. Number four, alternate picking is best because it's the most logical. We're going to dive deeply into that one. Next one, alternate picking is best because it feels more natural. We'll take a look at that one too. Next claim is alternate picking is best because it's simple. There's no thinking involved. Next claim, alternate picking is the best one because it helps you to keep time better. I always find that one really weird, but okay, we'll address that point in just a moment. Next one, alternate picking is the best because you can play rhythm guitar and palm muting better. Not sure about that. We'll take a look in a moment at that one as well. The next claim is, number 9, alternate picking is the best because it's been around longer than the other picking techniques. No, not so much. Well, I'll show you that in a moment. Number 10, alternate picking is best because most people use it, so it must be the best because most people use it. Yeah, I'm not sure about that one either. Number 11, alternate picking is best because many famous players use it. Well, this claim is true that many famous players, perhaps most, do use alternate picking, but that doesn't make it the best. And in just a moment, we're going to break down every single one of those claims, and then you can decide for yourself if any of these are true, and if they are true, if they even matter, if they have validity or any relevance. So, wow, on the surface, that looks like a pretty impressive list of 11 claims that people often say trying to describe why they think that alternate picking is better or superior or even as good as other picking techniques. Well, there's just one little problem. Some of those claims are blatantly false, and I'm going to prove it to you in a moment. Other claims, if they would be true, would actually not be an advantage. It would be a big, huge disadvantage for alternate picking. And still other claims don't even matter, especially when compared to the advantages of directional picking, which I'll outline a little later. So let's take a look at each of the pro-alternate picking claims in detail and keep an open mind about this, and then you can decide whatever you want for yourself at the end. Claim number 1. Alternate picking contains natural accents on every other note because there is a downstroke on every other note. This claim implies that downstrokes create accents and upstrokes do not. This is a total fallacy. It might be true that some people, when they play a downstroke, they might be hitting the strings harder, but the motion itself does not create an accent. If you have any, and when I dispute this with people, sometimes they'll say, well, it does because when you play a downstroke, you're working with gravity, and it must be the gravity that makes you hit the strings harder. Not true. If you want to prove it to yourself, go hang upside down or go do a handstand with your guitar against the wall and play downstrokes and upstrokes. If you normally pick harder when you do downstrokes, and now you're upside down and you do downstrokes and your pick is moving up towards the ceiling, because again, you're upside down, you will still pick harder if that's what you've practiced doing, even though the pick is going against gravity. So gravity doesn't make an accent. People make accents. But again, even if the claim would be true, it would not create an advantage. It would create a huge disadvantage. Here are just a few examples in real life where natural accents, if they existed, would be a huge disadvantage for alternate picking and alternate pickers. What if, let's say, the phrase you want to play is syncopated? What if you're playing triplets? What if you're playing a combination of 16th notes and triplets? What if you're playing in compound meter, 6/8, 9/8, 12/8? What if the lick begins off the beat, but you're starting with a downstroke? Now you have accents where maybe you don't want there to be accents, but because you believe that there's a natural accent, you're kind of stuck with it, right? Well, what if you play in odd divisions? If you're playing quintuplets or septuplets? What if you're playing an odd meter? What if you simply want some variety in your accents? What if you don't want any accents for a particular solo or a particular lick? If you believe that you're stuck with natural accents, all of those situations I just mentioned will be out of sync with what it is that you're trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish in the sound and the articulation of the guitar. Because in all of these cases that I mentioned, and many others, your down-up pattern will be out of sync with the strong and weak beats. And you'd be accenting notes that you might not want to accent, and not accenting the notes that you do want to accent. Fortunately, downstrokes do not naturally accent notes. You make or don't make accents when you play downstrokes or upstrokes. You are in control, or at least you should be. Alternate picking doesn't naturally accent anything, and that's a good thing, because any good player can and does accent the notes that he wants and doesn't accent the notes that he doesn't want to accent. If your downstrokes are automatically accented and the player's upstrokes are not, that would say way more about the player's lack of skill and control than it would say about the picking method he's using. It's simply not true that alternate picking has a natural accent inherent in the technique. Again, if it did, that would be a big disadvantage. Remember, you make the accents. You choose whether to accent a note or not. It's not the picking technique doing it all by itself. All right, let's take a look at claim number 2. Alternate picking has a distinctive, aggressive sound. This is a myth. One can indeed play with a very aggressive sound using alternate picking. However, that same aggressive sound can be created using other picking techniques such as directional picking. Like anything else, it just takes a little practice. Fact is, picking techniques, including alternate picking, do not have distinctive sounds. Players create the sounds. In the hands of a good guitar player with good articulation skills, with both picking systems, alternate picking or directional picking, you will never hear the difference between alternate picking and directional picking. Students ask me to play something using alternate picking and directional picking, and they can't hear the difference when without looking to see which guitar picking technique I'm using. This is true because I have practiced my articulation skills, and hopefully you have too. So if you want to accent on a downstroke, you create it. If you want to accent on an upstroke, you create that. With a bit of practice, anyone can do the same. If alternate picking did have a distinctive sound, that would immediately become a huge disadvantage whenever you want a different sound. Now, fortunately for alternate picking, it does not inherently have a distinctive sound. While it is true that some guitar players play with a distinctive picking sound when using alternate picking, again, that says more about the player than it does about the technique alternate picking. Claim number 3. Alternate picking has a stronger articulation. Many alternate picking players believe this is true, and many directional players would say the same thing about directional picking. Can both groups of people be right? Well, yes and no. While it may be true that the people who say that one picking technique for guitar has a stronger articulation than another, this only means that their preferred picking technique is more familiar to them. They are more comfortable playing with strong articulation with whatever picking technique they have practiced most. The reality is that when you train and master your picking articulation, you can play with all the power you want using either directional picking or alternate picking. Neither technique has any inherent advantage here. So the claim that alternate picking has stronger articulation is again false. Number 4, alternate picking is the most logical picking technique for guitar. Really? When moving from the G string to the B string, is it logical to play the note on the B string with an upstroke? How is that logical exactly? It's not. Yet that's precisely what alternate picking would require when the note played on the G string is played with the downstroke. So here's G string. I'm playing now with the downstroke going this way. Now my pick is already there. It's already in position. It's ready to play string 2 with another downstroke, but alternate picking would say, nope, can't do that. Not allowed. You've got to jump over string 2 without touching it. Slam on the brakes, turn around and go that way to play it with an upstroke. Where exactly is the logic in jumping over strings unnecessarily? I'm not seeing the logic. Are you seeing the logic? I don't see it. Okay? So, as we all learned in school, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. With directional picking, we use the straight line approach to maximize the motion needed to get to the following note. When using directional picking, you go directly to the B string from the G string, hence my name for the technique, directional picking. There is no need to memorize predetermined picking patterns or blindly follow an arbitrary down, up rule. Directional picking, not alternate picking, is more logical because as you're moving from string 3 to string 2, it doesn't matter if you played string 3 with a downstroke and now you go to string 2 with another downstroke, or if the last note you played in string 3 was an upstroke and now you're going to string 2 with a downstroke. You will always want to hit string 2 with a downstroke when coming from a lower string, such as the 3rd string. That is far more logical than jumping over string 2, slamming on the brakes, and then coming back. The distance required is massive, and it causes the chance of making errors is very high, and it slows you down. Number 5, alternate picking feels more natural. First, it's no surprise that alternate picking players would make this claim. That's because they have spent more time practicing alternate picking than other picking techniques. Thus, alternate picking probably does feel more natural to them. Fact is, though, any picking technique will feel most natural to someone who spends more time practicing that technique on guitar over another. Economy picking, directional picking, circular picking, all downstroke picking will all feel no less natural to those who use them most of the time. Second, alternate picking seems unnatural for most people learning to play guitar. In fact, most guitar teachers have to constantly remind their students, basically force beginning students, to stick with the strict alternate picking precisely because it doesn't feel natural to a beginner, because it's not logical to jump over strings when the pick is right there waiting to hit it. This is why teachers who teach alternate picking are constantly telling beginners, no, alternate, down, up, down, up. When you're changing strings, you did it down, now the next string's got to be up. It's constant trying to force them into this because it's not natural to someone who's learning it from the beginning. And many guitar students question the logic behind such a picking system that forces them to illogically and unnecessarily jump over strings like this. Let's say we've got a scale here. We've got down. We'll start with the downstroke, then up, then down. Now we're going to move from string 6 to string 5, and we're going to jump over string 5, slam on the brakes, and come back with an upstroke. How does that feel natural? Now, again, if you've been doing alternate picking for a long time, sure, it feels natural to you now because you've been practicing that way probably for a long time. So sure, in this moment, it feels more natural. But if you started over from the beginning and you didn't know any picking techniques and you just kind of played along and did what you felt was more natural, the chances, the chance of, 100 people all choosing the alternate picking motion as a way to feel natural all on their own would be pretty low. Maybe 10% of people might do that, but most people would not, okay? Guitar players who have not yet formed any particular guitar picking habits tend to find that alternate picking is objectively more natural to both the hands and the brain. It simply makes more sense and feels more natural, okay? The directional picking technique is the objectively more natural one. If you look here, we've got down, then up, then down. Now our pick is already almost resting on the 5th string. It just makes sense to go ahead and hit it with a downstroke. Then up, then down. And again, our pick is right in position to hit the 4th string. It just makes sense to hit it with a downstroke. That's the logic of directional picking. Claim number 6, alternate picking's simplicity make it the best picking technique for guitar playing. Now, as a concept, alternate picking with its strict down, up picking pattern is quite simple. And if you only play notes on the same string, it is simple in practice. However, once string changes are involved, alternate picking is anything but simple. If you look at the example on the screen, you'll see we start with the downstroke, although we could start with up. It really wouldn't matter. But we'll start with down, which is the normal thing to do with alternate picking. Right? Then you got up, then down, then up. Now, the 5th note we're going to play, instead of hitting that with an upstroke, here we are. Our pick is already waiting to play that string. Now we've got to jump over the string, stop, turn around, change directions, and hit that one with the downstroke. There's nothing simple about that. It's not simple as a concept. Why would you jump over strings when your pick is already there in position to hit it? And it's not simple in practice because of all the motions, the additional unnecessary motions and movements that have to be done to correctly play this lick using alternate picking. It's simply not simple. Directional picking is more straightforward with its single rule. Move to the following note in the most direct, shortest way possible, no matter what motion was used on the previous note or the current note. This principle is most logical. Hey, just move to the shortest distance to the next note without pre-planning anything. That's the most logical, most efficient, and most natural. It's the most straightforward as a concept and in practice compared to alternate picking. Claim number 7, alternate picking helps you keep time better. Now, some people claim that alternate picking helps you to keep better time. I'm not sure where this idea started, but it seems to have gained a lot of momentum over time as a pro-alternate picking claim. First of all, if one relies on a picking technique to keep time, then some essential timing practice is desperately needed. Number 2, just because alternate picking contains a simple down-up picking stroke pattern, doesn't make it any more precise than any other way to pick in terms of timing. This immediately becomes self-evident whenever you change strings using outside picking motions, which is common with alternate picking. In such cases, the pick must move over a much greater distance to the following note. This means you need to move your hand much faster to get to that following note on time. If not, you'll be late for the next note. How does that help one with timing? In fact, it does the opposite, because now you need to modulate more the speed at which your hand moves, making timing a bit harder. Claim number 8, alternate picking is best for palm muting and rhythm guitar. Now, whenever I hear someone say this, I simply ask, why? How so? How is alternate picking better for rhythm guitar and palm muting? Typically, no answer is given. Directional picking, I believe, is even better for palm muting and rhythm playing once you learn it. How? Well, the increased efficiency, reduced tension, and thus improved endurance for really fast and aggressive rhythm playing, improved accuracy, and keeping the pick in the string trench more often are better for rhythm playing and palm muting. And as I said earlier, good directional picking players can and do play with a very aggressive articulation, just as aggressive as alternate picking. The player, not the technique, determines the power and finesse and the accuracy of the picking articulation. Number 9, alternate picking is older than other picking systems for guitar. First, even if this statement were true, that wouldn't make alternate picking any better or worse than any other picking technique. And second, there is no evidence suggesting that alternate picking existed before directional picking. It's true that the term directional picking has only existed since 1989, the year I created the term directional picking. But the technique itself is very likely as old as the guitar pick itself is. The origins of both techniques cannot be known, but there is no reason to think that alternate picking is any older than directional picking. And even if it was, so what? Number 10, alternate picking is best because everybody uses it. There was a time when people used leeches to try to cure diseases. Many people, even doctors at the time, believed that this worked. That doesn't make the use of leeches the best way to cure illnesses. Two people who are wrong about something are no less wrong than one. The same is true of 200 people or 2,000 people or 20 million people. Look at all the elected politicians in government, all of whom presumably were chosen by a majority. Are these politicians the best simply because they won an election? Of course not. Voters can be, and often are, wrong. That same principle applies to the silly claim that alternate picking or any picking technique is simply better because many people use it. Popularity doesn't make something any better than slimy leeches or slimy politicians. Number 11, alternate picking is best because so many famous or great players use it. Now, many well-known guitarists who play great do use alternate picking. That is an undeniable fact and is not in dispute. What is in dispute is the assumption that alternate picking helped make them great. Fact is, these players are not great because of alternate picking, but despite it. When they were learning to play, for whatever reason, they learned alternate picking and practiced it for years and years and years. Despite all the now obvious flaws with alternate picking, these players unnecessarily practiced longer and worked harder to develop the exceptional skills that they currently have. With enough extra work and time, you can also become a great player using alternate picking. That is possible, but it will take much longer and be a lot harder. This is one reason why most guitar players won't become great. Instead of blindly following the techniques and methods of your favorite players, stop and ask yourself, is there a better, more efficient way to get where you want to go in less time? If you want to sound like your favorite player, you don't necessarily need to approach playing with the same technique. There may be a better way. And there is a better way to pick notes on the guitar. When I started playing, I also used alternate picking because my guitar teachers in the beginning pressured me to do so. After learning and switching to directional picking, I now see alternate picking like trying to run backwards. It makes more sense to just turn around and run faster with less effort facing forwards. Now let's rank the best picking techniques for guitar. I've identified 16 primary elements to evaluate the effectiveness of each picking technique. So number one is the economy of motion. How economical the motions are going to be when we use that technique. Number two, which one is the most relaxed and requires the least amount of tension. Number three, safety or very low risk of injury. Number four is the maximum speed potential using the technique. Number five is the ease of accuracy. In other words, how easy is it going to be to play accurately with the various picking techniques? Number six, the pick remaining in the string trench, that's the space between the strings, during string changes. Number seven, the least amount of time and effort required to master the technique. Number eight, that the technique integrates with sweep picking. Number nine, the ease of accenting notes off the beat. Now, here, we're going to focus more on the behavior of most people who use this technique, the various techniques, not what is inherent to the method itself, because as we talked about earlier, none of these techniques have inherent advantages, but how people approach the techniques, there's a clear difference there. So the next one, number 10, is the ease to accent beats. So this is, again, about behavior. So number 9 was accenting off the beat. Number 10 was accenting on the beat. Number 11, thumb muting potential. The potential to use the thumb to mute lower strings when you play to keep the guitar quiet so you don't get excessive string noise. Number 12, pick tilt consistency for optimum economy, speed, accent, and control potential. So pick tilt is not angle, it's how the pick is tilted towards the floor or towards the ceiling. Next is articulation. We want to evaluate the techniques based on articulation. Number 14 is no pre-planning required. Some techniques require pre-planning, some do not. So we're going to evaluate them all based on this as well. Number 15 is maximum expressive control. How expressive can you be with the techniques given? Some you have limitations, others you don't. Number 16, and the final one, is no limitations of musical choices. So using these 16 primary elements, the 3 best picking techniques for guitar are put to the test. Now, before evaluating them, note that not all 16 elements ought to be weighted equally. There is much more room for debate regarding which factors are more important, but in my opinion, the final 2 elements in the list, maximum expressive potential and no limits of musical choices, are the most important. Now, both alternate picking and directional picking do exceptionally well in these critical areas. However, economy picking, the one that could have been the most superior guitar picking technique, in my opinion, fails horribly in the 2 most crucial areas. Economy picking is near perfection until it comes to pre-planning and a massive restriction on expression and musical choices, making economy picking nearly hopeless as a standalone primary picking technique for guitar. That leaves directional picking as the undisputable objective picking technique winner for guitar, in my opinion. Now I'm going to make the case for why directional picking is the best picking technique for guitar and far superior to alternate picking, in my opinion. So the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. We talked about that earlier. And after playing any note, no matter if that note was played with a downstroke or an upstroke, the most logical way to move to the next note is to move directly to it. Hence the name directional picking. Now let's quickly look at all of the possibilities that you might encounter using the directional picking technique. So you'll see that in the first case, we've got 2 notes on the same string. So we're going to go down and then up, just like we would with alternate picking. No difference there. Okay. Example 2, again, we've got 2 notes on the same string. This time we're starting with an upstroke and then a downstroke. Again, works out to be the same. It looks the same as alternate picking. Example 3 is where we start to see the differences. So with directional picking, if you played string 3 with the downstroke, and now you're going to play a note on string 2, that picking motion for string 2 should be a downstroke. Now look at example 4. Here, we play the same note on string 3 with an upstroke, and then we play the next string, the one on string 2, with the downstroke. Okay? In both cases, when we change strings using directional picking, the first note that is played on the second string would be a downstroke if the note before was played on a lower string like strings 3, 4, 5, or 6. Okay? In example number 5, you see we have the opposite scenario. We start on string number 3, that's an upstroke in this case, and we go to string number 4, that's also an upstroke. That's the most direct way to get to string 4. In example 6, it's similar, but now we're starting on a downstroke for string number 3. And to move to string number 4, we again play with an upstroke. Okay? So every time we move from string 3 to string 4 or 5 or 6, any lower string this way, the first note of the new string would always be an upstroke. It doesn't matter what we did on the higher string. If it was down or up, doesn't matter. Once we go to a string in this direction, the first note of that change will always be an upstroke with directional picking. Now, we don't have to pre-plan anything like we would in economy picking. With economy picking, you would have to pre-plan what picking motion you're going to use for strings 3 and 4, or strings 3 and 2 if you're going that direction. We don't want to have to pre-plan anything and restrict what we can and cannot play because of the limitations and the requirements of the technique. So directional picking gives us the most efficient way to change strings without pre-planning. Now, if you compare that to alternate picking, if you notice what happens when you have an alternate picking example, it's not very logical and it's not very efficient. So looking at example number 7, if you played a note on string number 3 with an upstroke, alternate picking would require that you play the note on string 4 with a downstroke. Okay, that's not very logical and it's extremely inefficient. If you look at example 8, there we have another example of an inefficient way to move. You're on string number 4, and if that note is played with a downstroke, and you want to go to string number 3, alternate picking requires that you play this note on string 3 with an upstroke. Again, not logical and very inefficient. So directional picking is more efficient because when using directional picking, you're always moving to the following note in the shortest distance possible without any pre-planning like economy picking requires. So compared to alternate picking's outside picking motions, directional picking substantially shortens the distance between notes on different strings in both the horizontal axis, the x-axis, and the vertical axis or the y-axis. Okay? So this added efficiency reduces the speed required of your hands to make the string change quickly. Okay? Because directional picking never contains an outside picking motion. The pick spends more time down in the string trench. This is my term for the space in between the two strings that you're playing. So when you're making string changes, you want the pick to be in the trench as much as possible for as long as possible, because that's going to help make the distance that you have to move shorter. And a shorter distance means you don't need to move your hand as fast. That means you get speed for free. By comparison, outside picking motions that often happen when using alternate picking spend almost no time in the string trench, thus making alternate picking less efficient. You've got to move a greater distance. That means you've got to move your hand much faster, which can be difficult when you're playing at high speed. Directional picking is more precise. There are three main ways that directional picking is more precise than alternate picking. Number one, anytime the guitar pick leaves the string trench, the space down in between the strings, the risk of making a picking error increases. Since this occurs more often and for a longer period of time when using alternate picking, directional picking is more precise by default. The chance of making an error is much less. Number two, the additional efficiency created by moving in the shortest possible path to the following string reduces the picking speed required to make string changes, thus further reducing the chance of picking errors, especially when playing at high speeds. And number three, directional picking allows you to play without the picking hand needing to slam on the brakes to jump over a string when using outside picking motions. Slamming on the brakes after a faster movement is not as simple at high speeds, making the hand more prone to picking errors. That means either arriving too early to the next string or too late to the next string. Number four, directional picking has greater speed potential. Because directional picking is much more efficient, this automatically increases picking speed potential. Directional picking gains further guitar speed potential due to better use of inertia and less tension. And I'll explain about less tension later in this video. Number five, directional picking makes picking speed easier. The precision, thus reduced risk of picking errors, of directional picking allows you to push the upper limits of your guitar speed further with less risk of making mistakes in the picking hand. Yes, it's true that some alternate pickers can also play very fast, but they've got to work harder and be a bit more careful, especially when they are forced to make outside picking motions during some string changes. It's simply easier to use efficiency and precision advantages of directional picking, not only to play faster and cleaner, but to use less effort in doing so. Number six, directional picking is easier to master. Directional picking's better logic, efficiency, precision, speed potential, less tension, and greater ease of picking fast and clean all compounds on each other to make directional picking much easier to master than alternate picking. After teaching directional picking to several thousand guitar players online, I found two things to be true. Number one, experienced players who have spent years being alternate picking players find directional picking to be easier to master if, and this is a big if, they only use directional picking every day for about 100 days. After that period, their picking skills are almost always substantially better with directional picking, even after years and years of playing using alternate picking. But to fully master directional picking, it takes a bit longer than 100 days, but a significant improvement over alternate picking is almost always seen by day 100. Note, this is only true if the student uses directional picking only during that entire 100-day period. When students don't do this and practice both directional and alternate picking for 100 days, mastering directional picking takes longer. Number 2, students closer to the beginner level tend to find directional picking much easier to master, even if they've previously started with alternate picking. So the graphic you see on the screen now illustrates how much easier it is to gain greater guitar picking technique skills in less time using directional picking instead of alternate picking. That doesn't mean that you can't become a great player using alternate picking. You certainly can, and many certainly have. But it's easier to gain skills with directional picking once you learn, practice, and train how to do it. Number 7, directional picking accents are intentional, not automatic, mindless, or out of sync. Since directional picking has no natural accents, the accents must be intentional, not mindless or simply out of sync. To be fair, alternate picking also does not have natural accents, despite what some people claim. Directional picking as a technique does not have an inherent advantage over alternate picking. However, because so many alternate picking players tend to rely on the down-up motions of alternate picking to accent automatically on downstrokes, because that's what they practice doing, those players tend to have a significant disadvantage when accenting or not accenting on certain notes on the guitar. Number 8, directional picking is safer than alternate picking. The following are quotes from Dr. Tommaso Zilio, who is not only one of the greatest guitar teachers in the world, he also holds a PhD in physics. Now, these quotes are going to be him discussing the differences between alternate picking and directional picking as it relates to inertia, tension, and safety. Here's the first quote. Just before picking a string, your speed needs to be high, or you'll bounce right off the string. Just after picking, your speed is much lower since some energy is transferred to the string in order to make it vibrate. In outside picking, you pick the A string down. Now, the pick is between strings A and D. Your speed is low and downward. Next, you need to increase your speed to jump over the D string. Then, when you are at your peak speed, you need to slam on the brakes, reverse the motion, and take it up to enough speed to pick string D. This is very wasteful, and you need to put a lot of tension into your wrist to do it. The moment you train your directional picking, you'll realize that. He continues. In inside picking, you pick the A string up. Your speed is slow after picking, so it's easier to reverse the motion. You also have more space to accelerate since you're jumping over the A string, in other words, less stress on your wrists. All the energy you put in at this phase is useful in order to pick the D string since you're not stopping. So it's easier to reverse the movement due to lower residual speed before reversing. And most of the energy you put in goes into picking the string, not into braking and reversing the picking motion. He continues, keeping the speed constant, the smaller the motion or space, the higher the acceleration involved. And the acceleration is directly proportional to the force you need to put in, i.e. the stress on your wrist. Remember, force equals mass times acceleration. You don't need to believe the theoretical explanation. Try picking using alternate picking and directional picking as fast as you can. And notice on what notes your wrist tenses up. That is your empirical evidence. The fact that you are not measuring precisely the accelerations involved does not prevent you from detecting with your own body when you need to accelerate and which of the accelerations is higher. And that's all that's required to make my point. Directional picking has much less risk of injury in terms of less stress for your tendons. In addition, your arm and wrist can be more relaxed, which means more speed potential. Number 9, directional picking integrates naturally with sweep picking. Sweep picking is based upon directional picking's core principle: to pick the following note in the shortest distance possible. And it is opposed to the principle of alternate picking, strict alternation of down and up strokes no matter what. This makes sweep picking and alternate picking completely incompatible. Alternate picking players must learn how to sweep pick. For directional pickers, sweep picking typically comes pretty naturally because you're doing it very often naturally within the directional picking movements you're making. Some people ask, aren't economy picking and directional picking the same? No, they're not, because the philosophy behind each technique is different, and so is the thinking the player must do when using each technique. The picking motions appear to be the same when comparing the following two examples, but the reasons are very different. Remember, economy picking requires advanced pre-planning on all picking motions, while prohibiting notes required to pick when you have to jump over a string. That restriction severely limits what you can play with this technique. Some things just won't be possible using economy picking. Directional picking, however, its picking motions are based on getting to the next note in the shortest possible way without having to pre-plan anything. Therefore, you don't have any restrictions. There's no pre-planning. Nothing is prohibited. You can play anything. Here's another question that people often ask. If directional picking is the best picking technique for guitar, then why don't more great players switch to directional picking? That's an excellent question. And even if some ask it to try to imply that somehow directional picking is not superior to alternate picking, fact is, some great players have made the switch at some point in their playing. One great example is George Bellis. As directional picking becomes more widely known, more well-known players will make the switch. Directional picking wasn't the typical technique taught to people back when many famous players were learning to play. Even today, alternate picking is taught more often than other picking methods. So, those great players, they learned alternate picking many, many years ago, and they have invested many years of hard work, and they eventually became great, even though they were using a technique that made everything harder. Okay? So they could have reached the same level of skill that they have today in much less time, could have made it much easier for them if they had used directional picking, but they chose the path that they did, not because they were objectively comparing, but they just started with alternate picking and they got invested in it and they just kept on going. Also, for many, their alternate picking skills became good enough to play at a level that they wanted. Some of them simply didn't want to put in the extra work required in order to play even faster and with greater ease. They became satisfied with their existing skill levels, and that's okay. For others, the desire to play at a higher level was there. However, the thought of starting over once their music career had already begun may not have been a practical option for them. The constant cycle of writing and recording, touring, writing for the next album, recording, touring again, and the time pressure on them to keep up with that demand meant that overhauling their entire technique could be risky for them career-wise, unless they had, maybe a 6-month period where they had nothing going on in their life or their music career. Maybe then they could have the opportunity to take the break. But most of them are in the cycle of writing, recording, touring, writing, recording, touring. They don't have that kind of time, and some just don't have the interest. And many didn't make that choice or didn't want to dedicate the time, energy, and effort to do so in whatever bit of downtime they had. Now let's talk about why many guitar players won't switch from alternate picking even after seeing for themselves the objective evidence that directional picking is the best picking technique for guitar. Here are some common reasons. Number one, they don't want to feel that their heroes or their guitar teachers may have been wrong about alternate picking. If you have ever felt that way too, it could mean that you're just not yet using the best picking technique that could help you to become the player that you want to be and play at your very best with less time and effort to get there. But you can start today. Number two, they feel some strange need to defend the picking technique of their favorite players or of themselves. If you have ever felt this way, don't. Your guitar heroes, my guitar heroes, don't need to be defended. They're not under attack, okay? Some of my favorite guitar players ever are alternate pickers. I'm simply a fan of their music, of their playing, of their writing, but not a fan of the alternate picking technique that they may be using. Number three, they don't want to put their guitar playing on hold for 100 days or more to learn and practice and train to switch to directional picking. Now, if you've ever felt this way, hey, I get it. I went through the same thing. Now, I can tell you that today, this was one of the single best decisions I've ever made regarding guitar technique in my whole life. It was worth the short-term effort to get a lifetime of faster, easier, bigger gains for me. Whatever choice you want to make, that's up to you. Number four, they think others, more famous players or strangers on the internet, have already done the thinking for them. So they abdicate the decision about which picking technique is the best to strangers that they've never even met. Just because someone or 1,000 people more famous than you or more famous than me does things a certain way doesn't mean that you or I should. You're smart enough to think for yourself. I encourage you to do that. Number five, they think, I've already invested years of my life into alternate picking. I don't want to just abandon it and throw it all away. I too once thought that way, but I'm so glad that I switched to directional picking because the payoff has been huge. Reaching my level of guitar playing with alternate picking would have been possible for me, yes, but it would have taken me much longer and been much harder to get here. Now, number six, they make a half-hearted attempt to switch, but there's a rough transitional period of maybe 6 to 18 weeks where directional picking doesn't yet feel natural. Then doubt sets in and they give up soon before having a breakthrough. Now, if you've ever experienced that, there are 3 common reasons why you may have felt stuck. Number one, you may not have given up or abandoned alternate picking totally in the transition period. Never using alternate picking in that transition period is essential to properly and quickly training directional picking. Number two, you maybe just simply gave up too early. And number three, maybe you didn't take guitar lessons with a pro teacher who can train you the right way to master directional picking. Once you get past those things, it's smooth sailing from there, and the payoff is enormous. Next, I want to talk to you about why it's usually a bad idea to learn and master both alternate picking and directional picking. See, on the surface, it might seem like a good idea to master both techniques. However, it's usually a bad idea. Here's why. Number one, alternate picking has zero benefits over directional picking. None. Number two, training both techniques would not be the best of both worlds for two reasons. Number one, I just stated. Number two, there are only 24 hours in a day and 7 days in a week. Practicing an inefficient technique like alternate picking takes years longer to master than it does to master directional picking. Your practice time is much better invested in developing other areas of your guitar playing, such as phrasing or improvising or your rhythm skills or your ear training or music theory knowledge and many other things that make up your musicianship. Number four, trying to master two fundamentally opposing techniques is much harder than mastering one or the other. Naturally, directional picking would help you reach your guitar playing goals much faster. However, if you refuse to let go of alternate picking, then my advice to you is don't even bother to learn directional picking. In this case, you'd be better off sticking with alternate picking than trying to master both. So I think the rational choices are either stick with alternate picking, which you can still be a great player with alternate picking, but it will take longer and it will be harder. Or option two, make the switch totally to directional picking. There's a transitional period. It'll be a little rough for a little while. Learn from a great teacher who can teach you this technique and train you. Once you do, it's smooth sailing from there and you'll never look back. Okay? But I do not think it's a good idea to try to learn and master and maintain both. There's no reason to, and it will make everything harder for you. And finally, if you want to develop lightning fast picking hand speed, I will show you how, for free, in my new guide titled How to Build Lightning Fast Guitar Picking Speed. Again, it's totally free, and yes, it is based upon all the principles of directional picking. Click the link below to download your copy so that you can develop incredible picking speed with greater ease, even if you've struggled to do so in the past or you think you don't have a lot of time to practice. This will help you get where you want to go.